Hello again, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about informed consent. So some of this will be familiar. Some of it you might need to review and go back and think about a little bit. But we're going to talk about informed consent from the GCP perspective. So in other words, looking at ICH E6 as well as the CFR. So here we go. ICH E6 has some things to say about the consent, as you can imagine. There's actually quite a bit in ICH as well as in the code. So going through the glossary, the first thing that we'll notice is there is a definition of informed consent. And according to ICH, informed consent is a process by which a subject voluntarily confirms his or her willingness to participate in a particular trial after having been informed of all aspects of the trial that are relevant to the subject's decision to participate. Informed consent is documented by means of a written, signed, and dated informed consent. That is not surprising, and it's incredibly similar to what we're going to have in the code. ICH also mentions the ethical principles under which the consent process is undertaken. Specifically, that freely given informed consent should be obtained from every subject prior to clinical trial participation. So there's a lot of emphasis on autonomy and the individual's rights to make decisions for themselves. And then 4.8 talks about the informed consent of trial subjects. And 4.8 is rather long. And I'm not going to get into all the details here, and I'm certainly not going to read it to you. The 4.8 is actually 9 pages in the ICH PDF that's on the home page of the course. So, but it is nothing that isn't already also included in the Code of Federal Regulations. So, you know, things like language has to be understandable, there can't be any coercion, those kinds of things. So 4.8 is really where the meat of what ICH, where they talk about the informed consent process. 21 CFR Part 50, we spend our time being in 312, but Part 50 is the language where it talks about the consent process. And so Part 50 is sort of important to us. Subpart B is really where everything is written, and the informed consent of human subjects. There are some general requirements for informed consent, and those requirements include things like, excuse me, an investigator has to provide sufficient opportunity, so time for the potential participant to make their consideration. Information is in the language, it's understandable for the subject or the representative if that's the case. And then the consent also cannot include any language by which the participant waives any of their legal rights. So those are sort of the general requirements. Exception from general requirements exist as well. And so the exceptions say life-threatening situations, where all of these conditions are met. Life-threatening situations, informed consent cannot be obtained because of an inability to communicate with the participant. Time is not sufficient to be able to find the participant's legal representative. And also there is no available alternative method or of recognized, generally accepted therapy that would provide an equal or greater likelihood of benefit. So those exceptions are very specific, and all 4 of them have to be met. And in that case, when those requirements are all satisfied, then there's an additional requirement for a peer review to happen within 5 days. So, and the IRB has to be made aware. So these exceptions allow for really extenuating circumstances, but also still provide protection for that participant with the peer review and the IRB requirement. Also in this is, oddly enough, this is a little known fact, the President may waive the requirement for consent for any member of the armed forces if obtaining consent is not feasible, or is contrary to the best interest of the soldier, or is not in the best interest of national security. I don't think you're going to come across that as a clinical research coordinator, but perhaps if you're in the armed forces you might. But anyway, I thought that was really interesting. I've never had to worry about that, but you should know it's there. This next section talks about exception in the cases of emergency research. So emergency research takes those 4 requirements under the exception from general requirements and then adds on a little bit to those. So if you ever are involved in emergency research, you would become very, very aware of those 7 requirements that exist. But we're not going to get into them now because they are very narrow and very uncommonly used. And then 25 talks about the elements of informed consent. So just for me to remind you of what they are, the very first thing is that there is a statement that the study involves research, so the participants know that they're participating in research. How long that research, that participants' time, how long they'll be on the study, all the procedures that are going to be followed, and also then the foreseeable risks and discomforts, as well as the reasonably expected benefits. Also, a disclosure of any appropriate alternative procedures or courses of treatment. So if there is another treatment option that exists, that needs to be made aware to the participant. A statement about confidentiality of records, including the possibility of FDA review. Also, for a trial that has more than minimal risk, an explanation regarding compensation. Also an explanation as to whether any medical treatments are available if injury occurs and what they might be. There's contact for whom to reach out to and who to be in touch with if there's questions about the research and the research subject's rights. And then a statement that participation is voluntary and that with refusing to participate involves no penalty, and the subject may decide to discontinue participating in the trial at any time. There are additional elements. So those are the 8 that have to be in every consent form. There are also additional elements that exist and that may or may not be required, and the IRB will let you know. Those other additional elements are a statement that regarding risks that are currently unforeseeable. So you put them all in the consent form, but you also have to state, there might be ones we don't know about yet. A list of the circumstances under which the investigator may withdraw a participant without the participant's approval. Any additional cost to the participant. The consequence of withdrawing consent and the procedures for early termination. They might say, come back to the clinic one more time and get some more blood work. Just come back for a physical exam. Also, significant new findings developed during the course of all these clinical trials will be provided to the subject. And then the number of subjects expected, which I always personally found to be really interesting, because that would not be interesting to me at all in my decision-making model if I was on a clinical trial. But that has been determined by the code to be an additional element of informed consent. Also, documenting the informed consent, and that's either going to be the written consent form or the short form. And the written consent form, gets signed, and then a copy is given to the participant, and that's the documentation of the informed consent, actually signing the consent form. The short form then has the elements that are presented orally, and then the short form itself is also signed. So that is the documentation of the short form as well, and a copy of the summary is given to the participant. So the documentation is signing the consent form. Subpart D involves safeguards for children, and we're not going to really get into that here. But it talks about assent, right? The ability of children to agree to participate in clinical research and how that should be handled. It's not required, but it is highly recommended. Also, this area says, subpart D says, the state laws regarding minors take precedence. So you might find some differences if you were involved in pediatric research from state to state. 312 subpart D in section 312 part 60 talks about the general responsibilities of the investigators, and we already hit on those. They're repeated again. So allowing sufficient time for the consent process, and making sure that the environment is good and it's not coercive. So I'm going to ask you some questions. So we talk about the consent process being this like really straightforward thing. You're going to have a consent document. It's going to have these elements. The IRB is going to approve it. You're going to give it to participants. You're going to give them time. You're going to answer all their questions, right? And this is going to be a very straightforward process, and it is oftentimes anything but, because you're going to find all sorts of different situations. There are as many situations as there are participants out there, because that is sort of the variable that changes all the time, is what your participant is like and some of the circumstances. So we're going to go through some scenarios that are not uncommon, and sort of I'm going to help you sort of with some of your decision making and some of the questions you should ask in order to arrive at a really good answer. So the first question: is a witness signature required only when a subject has difficulty in understanding the contents of the ICD, which in my lingo is the informed consent document, or should a witness be present for every executed consent form? And this is a really good question, because it's sort of getting to the heart of what is a witness. The witness to the consent process is there to witness the information that's given to the subject, as well as the stating yes and witnessing that the participant is signing the consent form. There is some language in 46 CFR that says, and in a very large, broad way, a witness must be present to attest to the adequacy of the consent process, and then really most importantly to the voluntariness of the subject's consent, and that subject actually existed. Because in theory, you could have an investigator that could forge a signature on the consent form. So this witness is really there to be able to say, you know, did this look coercive, and in fact, did that person sign the consent form? You never really know when you're talking to a potential participant how deeply they understand the content of the consent form. You can tell an awful lot by the questions they ask and by the conversation you have with them, how well do they have a grasp on the contents. So you can never really say the person understood everything, but you know, this witness says yes, that the consent process was freely given, in other words, and that the person who signed was a real person. So I think that's a really good way to go about it. You should also know that if you have someone who has difficulty understanding the contents, then they might not actually be able to give legally effective consent. So you have to consider that too. So when you say difficulty in understanding the contents, what does that mean? Is it a language barrier? Is this a bilingual person? Is there a cognitive issue? Was there an educational issue? Is this person in a lot of pain at the time and they're having a hard time concentrating on the consent form? So all those things really have to be sort of thought about and sort of fleshed out a little bit. If you have someone who's really truly confused and doesn't have the cognitive ability to understand the contents, then they very well might not have the ability to give legal consent. So bear that in mind. All right, so here's another question. Who can serve as a witness on a consent? And who would be more suitable? And I'll give you an example. A son-in-law that's there for a visit with a mother-in-law, or someone like the front desk receptionist, right? Well, the FDA regulations, so the Code of Federal Regulations doesn't help us with this at all. It doesn't say at all, it doesn't define who can or who cannot be a witness on a consent. ICH E6 section 1.26 discusses in the glossary an impartial witness. So in ICH, the impartial witness definition is a person who is independent of the trial, who cannot be unfairly influenced by people involved with the trial, who intends the informed consent process if the subject or the subject's legally accepted representative cannot read, and who reads the informed consent or any other written information supplied to the subject. That would be an impartial witness, and that would be the kind of person that you would want if you were using a short form. Honestly, I would say that both of these people have their own issues that makes them impossible to be impartial. The son-in-law can't be, he can be impartial to And he can be sort of in a position where he's not unfairly influenced by people involved with the trial, but he does have some type of bias for or against his mother-in-law, and that's a relationship you probably don't understand. I don't know. So he might be okay as a witness if all you're asking him to do is say, yes, this was a process that happened, and yes, she signed the consent form, and it, then that's fine. The front desk receptionist might also be able to do that, but I don't think this person is not maybe perhaps directly involved with the trial, but they might be influenced by people in the trial. I think actually for really regular purposes, I think they would both work fine. On a practical note, you do want to have a witness that's as impartial as possible. Either of those in most clinical trial settings would be acceptable. If you really wanted, if we were talking about the short form and you really wanted to make sure someone was impartial, perhaps neither of them would work for that. But you definitely want to find someone who's as removed as possible. In places I've worked, I know they've used people in the billing office who would act as the witness. And that was a really good solution because they were there, a full-time employee and very readily available, but really not involved at all in the clinical trials. So finding the witness on the consent it's not a problem with the FDA, so you'll never get in a position where you're audited and it's going to be a problem. But you do, because this is such an important process, you do want to make this the best you can. Another question. What types of procedures are allowed prior to obtaining written informed consent for a clinical trial? For example, is it permissible to perform procedures that are considered to be standard of care, like the height, weight, temperature, blood pressure, those kinds of things prior to consent in non-emergency situations? For example, when I see my general doctor, they always get a height, weight, temperature, blood pressure, those kinds of things. Have you changed your medications? Those kinds of things every time I go there, right? And so the idea here is that procedures performed as part of routine medical practice, like those things I just mentioned, and which would be done regardless of trial participation, may be performed without consent, right? The results can be used for determining study eligibility without the consent. Informed consent, however, must be obtained prior to initiation of any clinical screening procedures that is performed solely for the purposes of determining eligibility. So this gets tricky. If I was going into my doctor's office and these are the things he was going to do, I go in to talk to him about a medical question I have. I get my height, weight, my vital signs taken. That isn't a problem. And then in the course of my visit with him, he talks to me about my medical problem and talks to me about participating in a clinical trial. That's okay. If those things are done, the height, the weight, the vital signs, those kinds of things are done solely for the purpose of determining if I'm eligible, then consent is required. So this can be a little bit tricky. You have to figure out what is being done for standard of care. When I say standard of care, this is just how all the patients are treated in a practice. Then that's okay. If it's done strictly for determining whether I can participate in a clinical trial, then I have to be consented. So you just have to sort of think, why are we doing these procedures? Another question. Do regulations require that consent form signatures include a notation of the time of signature? A timestamp can greatly assist a monitor or auditor in determining whether study-related procedures were carried out before or after signing the informed consent document. The regulations do not require time of signature anywhere. Only the date, in 21 CFR Part 50, only the date that the consent was signed. So this question is really coming at you from the angle of a study monitor, right? So the study monitor wants to put together the sequence of events that day to make sure that the informed consent was obtained before any study-related procedures were done. Time of day, really, in all honesty, and you'll find this out is generally not recorded in case histories except if something was time sensitive. So you're going to find that putting the time of day on the consent form doesn't really do a lot to establish that the consent was signed before participation in study-related procedures. Oftentimes, though, however, if the monitor goes back and carefully reviews the sequence of events that day, they can usually establish whether the informed consent was obtained before or after those procedures. But there's nothing by law there or ICH that requires a time of day. Another question. If a consent form is revised for a change in PI contact information, do patients need to be reconsented as soon as feasible, or can the reconsent process wait until their next scheduled monthly appointment? We have said in the past, right, and this is in the Code of Federal Regulations, we have to, when things change, update the consent form and make participants aware of changes. It might be a change to the risk. In this case, in this example, it is just a change in the PI and the PI's contact information. So the question is, excuse me, do we need to have those people come back and be reconsented right away? Well, according to 21 CFR Part 50, information that would, quote, relate to the subject's willingness to continue participation, end quote, in the study would be important to, to document, to communicate and document very promptly. But what promptly is, as soon as possible, what does that mean? And it will vary by people. The consent form is going to be your preferred process to do this. Eventually, participants are going to have to sign a new consent form. However, you could very easily, in this case, contact the participants by phone and say, your principal investigator's changing, here's the new name and here's the new phone number. When you come back next month for your appointment, we're going to ask you to sign another consent form. And then you could document that in a note. And I think that would be very reasonable given the information, the change of information. Because I would beg to argue that changing the PI would probably not seriously dissuade people from staying on the study. It is information that they need to have, but it's probably doesn't have a very heavy weight for whether those participants are going to be willing to stay in the study. So I think that would be okay to do a phone consent, especially if you have participants that are not sort of close by. If this is a study where you're gathering participants over several counties or a large geographic area. So I think a phone call with documentation if they can't be seen quickly, but the consent form eventually is going to have to be done. The most important thing you can do here, I think, is to have some type of SOP at your site that says this is how we handle that. I think it's a totally different situation if the consent form is revised for risks. In that case, you really want to reconsent them ASAP, and this would definitely take a phone call and rescheduling them to come back in earlier than their next scheduled appointment. So I guess it's going to depend on what kind of information is included in the revised consent form. But having an SOP that says how you do things will always help you and your other coordinators to make really good decisions and then to consistently act the same way. So I think that would be a really good recommendation here. All right, next question. During the course of an Alzheimer's trial, each enrolled subject's primary caregiver is asked to complete a questionnaire about the cognitive status of the study subject as part of the clinical trial. Should the caregivers themselves be required to sign a specific consent form? And I say in this case, this is sort of an easy one, I think. Some of the other questions I've gone through, there's more questions to be asked, and sometimes there can be different answers. But in this case, I'm going to absolutely say yes. There should be an informed consent process for those caregivers. There should be a informed consent document that's been approved by the IRB, because this data is being collected for the clinical trial. It is a clinical trial requirement. And I think that you would be misinformed to not ask them for their consent to participate. So this one I think is pretty straightforward, that you would have the consent of the primary participant and then their caregiver as well. Question. Since a consent discloses that the sponsor/CRO may have access to the subject's PHI, is it then acceptable to fax the signed consent document from the sites, if it's a multi-site study, to the sponsor and CRO for purposes of monitoring the documents? ICH E6 says one of the sponsor responsibilities is verifying that written informed consent was obtained for each participant in the trial. And so this gets to be an important thing. The sponsor is responsible for making sure the site consents participants. So sometimes sponsors in very large multi-site studies will ask to have the executed consent form faxed to them for purposes of verification. Sometimes they will do this before they will randomize the participant or ship drug to you. So I think that they're not being unreasonable asking for this. If it's a multi-site study and it's very big and it's very busy, that CRO and that sponsor might not be able to send somebody out to you frequently enough to be able to verify in a timely manner that you have consented participants correctly. So I think as long as the confidentiality of the documents faxed can be reasonably assured, the remote monitoring might be okay. Faxing is troubling because you don't know that the documents arrived at the correct place. So I would probably recommend, if the sponsor asked me to fax, I would probably say I would prefer to email or some other way of document sharing, simply because then I would know that it arrived where it belongs. So I think this could be acceptable. Again, having written SOPs or study procedures would be really advisable here so that you're consistently doing this in the best practice. So I think that you could do that, but again, you have to be really careful to make sure that all the PHI has been removed. Here are a bunch of references, as always. I love your questions. I would love to talk about this with you some more, so please let me know, and I will talk to you soon. Take care.